Well, ladies and gentlemen, another interesting day in politics. And to be honest, the politics and the news around the politics at the moment just doesn't get boring because so much is happening. And before I get on to the main video of today, can we yet again remind you, please subscribe to the channel and help me grow to 200,000 subscribers. So let's get on to the first news story. And let's turn our attention to, well, Britain. Let's first start with the basic news story that yesterday the Palestinian Authority opened a Palestinian embassy in London, specifically in Hammersmith. Now, the embassy was officially opened by the Palestinian Authority's ambassador to the UK. Now, it's important to remember that the Palestinian Authority claims to represent Palestine, but they were never voted in, they were not part of any democratically elected state, and the current leader is currently serving like year 18 of his 4-year term. Now, the ambassador had previously served as the chief Palestinian diplomat representing Washington until his tenure was ended in 2018 after the Trump administration revoked his visa and it forced his departure. Now, at the opening ceremony, the ambassador said that he was renewing efforts to free Palestine, which, as I'd said yesterday in my video yesterday, is like basically free Narnia, because what are the borders? Where are we talking about? They said that they want to end the occupation. The occupation of what? Where is being occupied? Is it all of Israel? Are you basically trying to do from the river to the sea? Because that's not a Palestinian state. In any case, he said that they want to establish a Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital. Remember that this offer had once been made to the Palestinian Authority before, and they rejected it because they want all of Israel, not just a little bit of a carve-out. They said they were going to push for an international arms embargo on Israel and are pushing for international legal and accountability measures to be placed against Israel. Basically, they're going to try attempt to use the embassy in London to delegitimize Israel. Funny enough, that's pretty much what Israel said would happen when Britain said they were going to do this whole embassy thing and recognize the Palestinian state in the first place. Nice to see that what's happening is exactly what everybody knew was going to happen anyway.
My friends, this embassy will not only serve as a bridge between our nations and our peoples. It will remind the world. It will remind the world every single day, that Palestine is here. Palestine endures. Palestine will be free.
So let's turn our attentions first to Keir Starmer. Now, for those of you who don't know, Keir Starmer's popularity is now actually at a lower figure than the disposed Venezuelan dictator. The disposed Venezuelan dictator that everybody's happy just got disposed. Well, apparently he had a higher approval rating than Keir Starmer. And this is not being lost on Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of Great Britain. Now, as his popularity has plummeted, Labour now trails below Reform UK, 18 months after the landslide victory that they got in the last rounds of voting. Now, it's important to remember that Labour didn't get like mass amounts of votes. They got just the majority vote, and the majority vote was still very low, with a record low turnout in that election. So they won kind of like by default just because people were protesting against the Conservatives, not supporting Labour. Now, this has all been raised with Keir Starmer, who says that actually he's not going to step aside despite being hugely unpopular and there being a huge push for him to leave government. Instead, he argues that churning leadership would create chaos, and so it's better for him to stay, despite being hugely unpopular. And this is actually showing you that Western governments really are just as fragile as these despots they're disposing of in places like Venezuela. And public trust in the leadership is just as good in the UK as it is in South Africa. Nobody trusts politicians, because politicians are scumbags regardless of where you are. You can go to Britain and think, oh, at least I don't have ANZ politics. No, you've got UK politics, which are just as bad. And I know there's going to be that one stooge in the comment section that goes, well, at least he doesn't lie. And, Britain something, something, something. So let's turn our attention to one of the scandals embroiling the Prime Minister. Now, for those of you who don't know, and I covered this in a video, the Prime Minister managed to import himself his own very jihadi from Egypt. And he said that he had made the deportation of this individual, granted him citizenship, a top priority of his government, only for him to land in the country and be deeply embroiled in a scandal around anti-Semitism and tweets that he had placed online basically calling for the killing of white people. This was rather a big embarrassment for Keir Starmer and his government, who then asked the question of how the hell have you made it a top priority for you to import a load of jihadis? Did you not actually do any real due diligence? Like, are you nuts? So Keir Starmer actually gave a speech in which he said, well, actually this had all slipped below the cracks, and it really was a failing of his advisors. In fact, you can have a watch of that right here.
I mean, even just in the last few days, I wonder, are you sorry that you wrote you were delighted that a British-Egyptian activist, Alaa Abdel Fattah, was back in the UK when he'd previously said killing any colonialists, especially Zionists, was heroic. He also said there was no genocide against the Jews by the Nazis. Are you sorry you welcomed him back to the UK?
Those comments are abhorrent, and I condemn them utterly.
But
so let's be really clear about that. As I made clear, I didn't know about those comments at the time of welcoming Al-Fattah to this country. But what I would say, just stepping back from it, Laura, is, as you know, with consular cases, one of the jobs of the British government, all British governments, not just this British government, where someone is being treated in an improper way in another country, if they're a British national, is to take action to try to alleviate that situation. And that's why I acted in this case. And actually previous Prime Ministers acted in exactly the same way in the actions they took to try to get him released, because that's what happens in consular cases.
But it's almost impossible to understand that no one in the government had bothered to check what he'd said before, and then that the Prime Minister of this country says he's delighted to welcome somebody back who'd expressed those views. Are you sorry you did?
Well, of course I regret that, and your point that somebody in government should have known is one I've made myself to the appropriate team, because I do think I should have been made aware, and I wasn't made aware.
But you see, there's a problem here, ladies and gentlemen, because there's this wonderful thing called the internet, and the internet never forgets. And in resurfaced footage that have come out from 2022, there's a video where Keir Starmer says in public that apparently he knew that the individual had been jailed, and he was in jail in Egypt for spicy social media posts. Now he claims he knew nothing about it. In fact, don't take my word for it. Here's the video.
And can I start by raising the case of Alaa Abdel Fattah? Yeah. As the Prime Minister knows and has said, he's a British citizen, jailed for the crime of posting on social media and been imprisoned in Egypt for most of the last 9 years.
So basically what we can see from this is, he's a liar, and he's been caught lying, and that's why he's severely unpopular. But don't worry, he's recognized Narnia, the state of Palestine. Now, for those of you who sit there and go, well, Palestine should be given an opportunity to, have its own government. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce you to the leaders of Gaza at the moment, and that is Hamas. And bear in mind that the Palestinian Authority is like a slightly milder version of Hamas, but not that dissimilar. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you specimen 1, which is a lovely gentleman telling you that if you're a Muslim and you live in Jerusalem, you should buy a knife. It only costs 5 shekels, and then you should do stuff and stuff and stuff. In fact, don't take my word for it. Yeah, have a watch.
ياكو يا أهل القدس بالسكاكين امعطوا رقاب اليهود كلها هي تقف على العرق من هان 5 شيكل تشتري لك سكينة واضية مضيها وهنا على طول حزه 5 شيكل 5 شيكل إنك تذل دولة.
Now, at least the white liberal women who love to protest of free Palestine, they will all be saying, well, it's not that bad. And I'm reminded that Palestinian doctors from Gaza say that men have the right and must beat their wives, because apparently wife beating is therapeutic. It's not vindictive. Again, don't take my word for it. Have a watch.
هو ضرب يقصد به تنبيه المرأة إلى أن حياة الأسرة في خطر. تنبيه المرأة على أن علاقاتنا الزوجية مهددة، فانتبهي حتى لا تتعرض هذه الأسرة للهدم وللدمار، حتى لا يتأثر أولادنا ولا يتأثر مستقبلنا. ثم بعد ذلك يعني ضرب رمزي، وإذا كان ضرب حقيقي له شروط ومواصفات، يعني بدءا من المقصود ليس الانتقام وليس الإيذاء.
إذن هناك دكتور زياد ضوابط لهذا
نعم.
نعم
نعم بالفعل ضوابط. أولا أن يكون مقصودك الإصلاح والحفاظ على هذه الحياة. ثانيا إذا ضربت فتجنب مواطن الإيذاء، الوجه والمقاتل وكذا، وأن يكون ضربا ليس ضربا مبرحا، اللي هو يعني ليس ضرب انتقام. أنت هذه زوجتك كما يقال، ينبغي يعني سمعنا كلنا بنسمع في المثل ضرب الحبيب زبيب، ينبغي أن يكون ضرب الزوج لزوجته إذا وقع هو ضرب الحبيب لحبيبته. تصور معي كيف يكون ضرب المحب، ضرب الأب لابنه، ضرب الأم لابنتها عندما تخطئ، ضربا علاجيا.
نعم.
وليس ضربا انتقاميا بهدف الإصلاح وبهدف تنبيه الزوجة في حالة يعني خطئها وفي حالة عدم استجابتها للموعظة وللهجر وكما يقولون آخر العلاج الكي. ولذلك أقول هذه آية الحفاظ على الحياة الزوجية، آية الحفاظ على الأسرة.
So yes, these white liberal women are reminded that it's okay to beat your wife, as long as you don't break her bones or damage her internal organs. How did I say it? The doctor said it. And these white liberal women also told me that I should trust the science and trust the doctors. So, I don't know, let me know what you think of that in the comment section below. Now, obviously, we need to do all of this because there's a genocide in Gaza. I mean, we've heard about that a lot. But I'm also reminded that the UN actually fired a genocide expert for saying that there was no genocide in Gaza, an actual genocide expert. But she did, however, say that the October 7th massacre that was targeted at Jews, well, according to her, the genocide expert, that was a genocide, or at least genocidal intent. So it's very interesting that now that an actual genocide expert has commented on this, who were fired for not towing the line and supporting the current thing, and actually saying the reverse, the complete contrary to the current thing narrative, we can't have the earth, fired. Because that's how these global bodies work. Now, it's because of this, and because of the hypocrisy in the rules-based order, if you want to call it that, that's basically the globalist order. Well, Trump himself is not a fan, and to be frank, neither am I. This whole globalist idea, this globalist rules-based order is just a load of rubbish. And we've seen where it's led us as the world. Every country has suffered from the rules, and as many individuals are now saying, if the rules-based order protects dictators in Venezuela, then pretty much screw the rules. Nobody wants to follow those. Now, as you'll know if you've been watching this channel, well, the United States launched a direct military strike on Venezuela, and that targeted the government and military infrastructure. Now, the president was captured and removed, marking one of the most dramatic U.S. interventions in Latin America in decades. Now, Trump framed the operation as a law enforcement action, a response to alleged corruption, drug trafficking, and regional instability, and a move to secure Venezuela's oil infrastructure. Now, the U.S. also signaled that they would temporarily oversee Venezuela, implying more of a short-term strike and not a long-term intention to govern the country. Now, for those of you who don't know, Venezuela has like the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Oil production itself has collapsed by roughly 70% since the 1990s, largely due to mismanagements and sanctions. Now, Trump's move places energy security, resource control, geopolitical leverage, all of this back in the center of U.S. foreign policy. So effectively, his hard power politics means that he has re-exerted power control through this one singular action. And obviously that have left a number of weaker countries that rely on the rules-based order to protect them feeling rather vulnerable. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I know what you're thinking. There's lots of people that have sat there and talked about, oh, it's all about the oil. Well, that may very well be true. But in any case, I actually got a copy of the sealed superseding indictment from the U.S. District Court, the Southern District of New York, which is basically the document they've used to charge Nicolas Maduro and senior Venezuelan officials. Now, it's important to understand that senior Venezuelan officials have not been captured. It's only the president so far. Now, according to the indictment, it alleges that Maduro led and protected a state-enabled narcotics enterprise that targeted large quantities of cocaine into the United States over many years. Now, the prosecutors are claiming that Maduro used his position, both as foreign minister, vice president, and now the president, the de facto ruler, to provide diplomatic cover, passports, and protection for drug trafficking, and that he shielded traffickers from law enforcement and used forms of protectionism for his cronies. Sounds pretty much like the ANC, I suppose. Now, the indictment frames the operation as narco-terrorism, alleging cooperation with the FARC and the ELN guerrilla groups. Now, Venezuela is described as a key cocaine transit hub, with U.S. estimates that around 200 to 250 tons of cocaine per year pass through the country, and this was just around 2020, so it's probably gone higher since then, although official statistics are not available. Now, the smuggling methods allegedly include aircraft from airstrips or controlled airports in the country, controlled by the government, and fast boats and container shipping routes. Now, the named co-defendants include many senior Venezuelan officials, which include the vice president. Now, the indictment lists multiple acts, which include bribery of officials, protection of multi-ton drug shipments, and the use of armed groups to secure trafficking routes. Now, the formal charges include narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation conspiracy, and firearms offenses linked to drug trafficking, which includes machine guns and destructive devices, which I suppose will include bombs or bazookas or whatever else they use. Now, the filing includes broad forfeiture claims targeting assets linked to the alleged crimes, and it asserts that Maduro's presidency is illegitimate, citing disputed elections and noting that many countries, including the US, did not recognize him as a head of state. I must highlight that South Africa did. We did recognize him as a head of state, because that's just how we roll. Now, turning to South Africa and Venezuela have had diplomatic relations since 1993, which includes embassies. In 2008, a cooperation agreement covering energy, mining, and agriculture was signed. Petro SA had previously held exploration interests in Venezuela, tying SA indirectly to its oil sector. Now, today, trade with Venezuela is rather small and it's largely symbolic. South Africa exports around 13 million US annually to Venezuela and imports roughly around 3 million, mostly chemicals. Now, despite the low trade volumes, Pretoria still frames Venezuela as a strategic South African political partner. It's constantly like this, right? I mean, we do like no trade with Russia or Iran, but they're like strategic partners. And you've got to understand, they are not strategic trade partners. They are strategic partners of the ANC, because the ANC likes to align itself with all its communist buddies. So really what they should say is, well, they're commies and we like to stick with commies. Then we'd all be like, oh, okay, we got you. But apparently it's a strategic political partner, even though we do nothing with them. Now, Pretoria formally warned the UN that the US's action was unlawful and unilateral. In other words, they did it on their own. And that's true. They didn't actually include anybody, including the Brits. They suggested that the US has violated the UN Charter and undermined the rules-based international order, which, as I said at the start of this video, rules-based international order can go do one. It's just a pile of crap, isn't it? Now, South Africa has argued that military intervention historically deepens instability, and that arresting foreign leaders by force sets a dangerous precedent, because they might be next. God willing, inshallah. Officials warn that this approach incites anarchy and normalizes might makes right. Although I do recall that we already had anarchy in South Africa underneath, the normal democratic order. was called 2021 and occurred in Durban. But that's just me, maybe my memory is faulty. Now, the economic reality for South Africa is that South African fuel supply will not be immediately affected. South Africa has never imported Venezuelan crude. So Venezuelan produces heavy sour crude incompatible with most South African refineries. So the real risk is indirect. Well, there could, in theory, be shipping disruptions as us sending things to the United States. It could be refining bottlenecks, although very unlikely, and possibly broader geopolitical instability just because of people trying to escape the country and go on asylum. I don't know. But we're trying to be generous here. We're trying to really understand what the actual risk could be. And the reality is, there ain't any. Meanwhile, gold and platinum prices are surging due to global uncertainty and potentially a 15 to 20 billion in extra export revenue for South Africa. So to be frank, this is actually doing us a favor. We're getting an extra 15 to 20 billion in revenue because Trump did this. We should be like hugging Trump and like kissing him and telling him he's the best thing ever. But not the ANC, right? Because, them commies love to commie. Now, the temporary relief will bring budgets, relief, and tax pressure relief to a country that severely needs it, our own. Now, long-term vulnerability will still remain because South Africa lacks domestic energy resilience, and we still need a partner for it. And to be honest, our partners are dwindling by the day. Probably going to land up with Washington. Oh, wait, we're not doing very well with our partnership with Washington. And that really brings the problem, doesn't it? Because relationships between Pretoria and Washington are already deteriorating, and this was occurring even before Venezuela. Now, the US frustrations, as you know, have included South Africa's UN voting alignment with China, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, and disputes over BEE expropriation without compensation and farm murders. Now, the disputes with the US have actually landed up in a crescendo with the current appointment of the US ambassador, who himself has been appointed to be less patient with South Africa and to apply more direct pressure. Now, the US already imposed higher tariffs on South Africa than any other African country. They boycotted the G20, and they declared South Africa's ambassador in the United States persona non grata. Although remember, they did that after they tried to pull the race card in the US and it didn't really go very well. Now, proposed US legislation still sitting before Congress includes sanctioning senior ANC officials and triggering a formal bilateral review with Washington and South Africa with the view of ending relationships between the two. So, we're not exactly doing very well, are we? And so how do we actually ingratiate ourselves to the US? We criticize Washington over Venezuela, which we all know will not endear Pretoria to the Trump administration. And they could actually really harden the US position on South Africa in terms of trade, tariffs, and sanctions. So yet again, we still risk losing access to our preferential trade with the US and becoming diplomatically isolated at a critical economic moment. The ideological gap between South Africa's foreign policy rhetoric and US priorities are widening. And as I said in my video yesterday, what we are really seeing going on here is that the world is dividing. They're dividing into the Allies and the Axis powers, in the equivalent of World War II. And what's really going on here is that South Africa is actually aligning itself with the Axis powers. We are not aligning ourselves with the Allies. And we just need to understand that. I don't have any comments on it. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's not a good thing. I don't know. You let me know what you think in the comment section below. Unfortunately, the right side of the war is usually determined by the victors. So who will be the victors? I don't know. Probably the US, but who knows? In any case, these are just my opinions. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. And until tomorrow, bye.